Hello coaches and welcome to this edition of Give and Go Live. My name's David Newbury and I'm joined by my colleague Ian Barker. Hello Ian.
Hello David, pleasure to be here.
So Ian, we have just completed a series looking at the makeup of the back four or the back line of the defense, fours, threes, and even a two. And now we are going to be looking at the front line and looking at one striker, two strikers, and potentially three strikers. And this presentation is looking at a one striker setup for our team. So let's talk about how that might relate to numbering, Ian.
Certainly. So going back to our approach towards the numbering system, when we're talking about one striker, we're almost certainly going to give them the designation of number 9, regardless of what number is actually physically on their back. And they're going to be pretty much isolated alone in this initial interpretation. So we may play with wide support players in 7 and 11, and we certainly have midfielders underneath the number 9. But in this particular interpretation, it's a lone striker, a single striker, holding the upfield line exclusively by themselves.
So Ian, let's talk now about an example or a couple of examples of strikers that fit this role very well. And a modern day example is the current striker at Fulham, Alexander Mitrovic, big, strong, burly centre forward, old-fashioned in some respects. Someone like Brian McBride would be a very good American example of a similar type of striker, someone who's able to hold the ball up when they are outnumbered with their back to goal. A person who has a mental capacity to be able to deal with the physical demands of the position, but relentless commitment to compete when they're certainly outnumbered by defenders, and that's likely to happen if we're playing only one up top. But they also have to have very good technical qualities, certainly to receive the pass, to bring it under control, to demonstrate a level of strength in order to hold the ball up, to allow our midfield players and our fullbacks to get forward. And of course, they need to be able to occupy as many of the defenders of the opponents as possible, certainly the two central defenders if they're playing against them. So Ian, let's talk about some of the features of what a one striker option is in our front line.
Sure. So if we engage their back four, or at least the two central players, by having this high number 9, it's going to impact the available wide space for us. So you can see here in this diagram that our 11 and our 7 have kind of got in a gap between the corresponding 7 and 11 and the 2 and the 3. So it's kind of interesting because we can work the space differently, because when there's only one central striker, it becomes a little bit more difficult for these players to understand what their role is. Traditionally, they'll probably be connected to their two centre backs, but if there's only one number 9, it may impact that, so it can impact our wide space. I think one of the critical positives, however, is that if we have the number 9 driving the opponent as deep as possible, and he or she is by themselves, we now have the ability for all kinds of players running from deep positions and getting in behind the opponent's midfield and ultimately running at, with or without the ball, the back four. So I really like this notion from the point of view of bringing in multiple deeper lying options. And again, when that number 9 is really high, this space here, I'm just going to use the arrows, this can be a really devastating space, and you'll hear coaches talk about playing between the lines, and it's trying to drop players into these spaces between the opposing midfield forwards or the opposing midfield and defenders. And I do think the lone striker has the potential to do that. But again, my favorite aspect of this is to the second bullet highlighted in yellow, which is this notion of coming from deep. And I think your animation will show this.
Yeah. A very short animation, Ian, but demonstrates certainly how the number 9 is somewhat isolated and must hold the ball up to bring the other players into play. Let's now talk about some of the challenges that we experience if we only play with one striker.
Yeah, so one of the important things is, and it's in the qualities that you identified with Brian McBride and Mitrovic, if the number 9 just wants to run away, you can appreciate that he or she will get very detached from their midfielders and support players. So the idea of this lone striker is to bring people into play by hold-up play. So that's critical. There was a few games this weekend that I was listening to where teams played with a lone striker in the English league, and the commentators commented how if you didn't give the player some ball that he or she could handle, and you were continually playing it to their head, it was no surprise that they could not retain possession, and so consequently the teammates could not come and join them. So the number 9 has to be physically able and mentally engaged. If the number 9's having a bad day, the lone striker system will mean that you're almost certainly going to be back in your own backline the entire time. So he or she has to be mentally, physically engaged and willing to hold up play. Of course, if the 4 and 5 are successful in winning the ball and your midfield in white and your backline in white is not able to support the number 9, you can appreciate how quickly now the opponent can play out the back, because it's very hard to pressure them up the field if the 9 turns the ball over quickly. So one of the challenges here, one of the things to be aware of is if you can't come out to support your 9, you may get bunkered in deep because the opponent can play at you. And I think the video will show that.
Yeah, now let's look at the video, Ian, and then we can discuss a little bit afterwards. So, Ian, we saw definitely the isolation issue with the number 9, particularly if we are inaccurate with our passing. Would you like to take the discussion from there?
Yeah, I think the animation shows our number 9 trying to chase the ball back and forth as well. And so, you know, that's great that they want to put the physical effort in, but you can't possibly effectively press a back 4 with your number 9. And that's not the kind of work you want your number 9 to do. So if we aren't successful in retaining it, I might ask my number 9 just to take up a position here and not move. And so at least we know, the rest of my team knows, that the opponent's going to have to come out to this flank because our number 9 has cut off the play out to the other flank. But one by themselves, it's going to be really difficult to dictate the way the opponent plays unless we're intelligent. And then if you leave your number 9 extremely high, and then the bank of 5 drop deep and the bank of 4 drop deep, if you keep doing that, of course, you can't connect with the number 9 should you win the ball. So there needs to be, this distance can't get too great too often, because otherwise you just simply are bunkered in the entire time.
So, Ian, one of the things that strikes me about one striker is that we certainly have to have a very unique type of player, someone who is capable of running a line on their own, potentially with 4 defenders around them. What do you think should determine whether you play with one striker? Is it our defensive necessity, or the fact that we feel that we have one person that can seriously compete with so many defenders?
That's a great question. I think one of the reasons it's in vogue in highest levels of the game is there are an abundance of midfielders and there are very few out-and-out strikers. So I think it becomes almost a necessity to get all your midfielders on because you have less strikers. Also, though, if this person, if your number 9 is a good finisher, then where do you want the ball? You probably want the ball here and here, serving into the box for that number 9. And the best way to achieve that is to come in centrally to that number 9. And then they're looking, and if I was coaching my youth players, I might say you kind of got 3 touches. You've got 1 to receive it, 1 to gather it. So you received it, now you get it under control. And then your second one is, your third one is to lay it off. So the player now lays it off. And then where do they go? They go into the box, because that's where you want your striker, the person that can score goals. So I think it can be the qualities of the 9, but very often it's just simply you don't have a lot of 9, so you want to bring all your midfielders in.
Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you, coaches, for joining us on this edition of Give and Go Live.